Hello, my name is Will Mercer. I'm a senior designer with Informing Designs in Austin, Texas. I've been a Claris FileMaker developer for over 10 years. In addition to being a developer, I'm also a certified professional coach, a certified project manager, and I'm a professional actor. My husband and I live in Austin, Texas, and we have 3 dogs, 2 cats, poison toads, a Russian tortoise, and lots of fish. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in communication studies, and have spent the last 30 years working with organizations of various sizes, helping them to manage technology change and implementations. And I love this work. I am particularly passionate about bridging the communication gap between developers and business folks. This video series is called Digital Transformation Lost in Translation. In the videos that follow, I will be sharing information and experiences with the goal of helping both developers and businesses navigate the often complicated perceptions, vocabulary, and challenges of navigating digital transformation successfully. Have you ever developed an app for a client and they weren't satisfied? Have you ever asked for an app and what you got isn't what you asked for? Have you ever had a misunderstanding? Have you ever been confused about a request from a developer or client? If the answer is no to any of those questions, please give me a call. For the rest of us, it has happened. And when we consider the cost and the hours and the resources it takes to transform systems and processes, it is a worthy complication to explore. After I completed my master's degree in communication studies, I went to work for a large financial services company. When I started, we were still using what we call dumb terminals. Data was often entered into various systems using punch cards. Information was passed to insurance companies, tax offices, and other banks using reels of magnetic tape. Correspondence was handled by writing letters and mailing them. About 2 years into my time with this company, we began the transition to PCs. As the head of training and development, it was my job to train folks how to use the PCs, participate in the reimagining of business processes, and manage the transition across the company. Over the next few years, we implemented PCs, the imaging of documents, email, and lots more. This dramatic change was my first encounter with what we now call digital transformation. It was fun, it was exciting, and it was very interesting. Let me give you one example that I think helps illustrate what this presentation refers to as lost in translation. In the very early weeks of implementing PCs across the company, my team and I received many phone calls with issues. I will share with you the one that I remember most vividly. My phone rang, and on the other end of the line was a very frustrated employee. "My TV won't work." I said, "Okay, well, tell me what you're experiencing." They said, "I said my TV won't work." Great start. I asked if the CPU was plugged in. The what? I explained that the TV was connected to a box called the CPU, and I wanted to confirm that it was indeed plugged into power. It took some time, but we managed to confirm that the CPU was indeed plugged in. After several more minutes of frustrating exchanges as I attempted to help the individual log in and troubleshoot the issue over the phone, I asked the following question. "Can you describe the screen to me?" There was a pause, and then they said, "It is square and made of glass." I knew immediately that I was not going to be able to help this person over the phone, so I asked about the area they were located in, and I headed out to help. I was able to spend some time with this person and helped get them logged in and where they needed to be in the system. And in case you're wondering, the computer was indeed plugged in. It just wasn't powered on. I share this story often, number one, because it's funny, and number two, it illustrates how easy it is for miscommunication and misunderstanding to happen. When I said screen, I meant the images displaying on the monitor. When they heard screen, they translated it as monitor. Businesses and developers really do speak different languages, and there are often translation errors that contribute to uncertainty, misunderstanding, and frustration. In these sessions, we're going to take a moment to stop, breathe, and look at digital transformation from the perspective of communication, all in an effort to avoid getting lost in translation. First, we'll talk briefly about digital transformation and what is required to do it well. Second, we will explore the players in the digital transformation process. Third, we will talk through approaches and techniques to creating understanding between the players. Fourth, we will discuss storytelling as a tool to build relationships, create rapport, and expand understanding. Fifth, we'll talk about tools that can be used to support the digital transformation process and ensure accurate translation. Finally, we will share some lessons learned from my own experience. It is my hope that you will leave these sessions reflecting on past experiences, what went well, what didn't, and intrigued, thoughtful, and purposeful about what you could do differently going forward. Now that you know a little more about me and about where we're going in this video series, we're ready to dive in. In the next video, we will look at an overview of the digital transformation process. I hope you'll join me. Let's begin by thinking about digital transformation. This is how Gartner defines digital transformation. In summary, when you are changing your technologies, you're engaged in digital transformation. So what is required to do it well? Let's look at digital transformation from two contexts, integration and collaboration. To do that, we can ask, what is required to digitally transform? First, we can ask, where is the data? Sometimes data is in a system that needs to be updated or changed. Data can also be found in spreadsheets, notebooks, whiteboards, calendars, emails, and brains. Sometimes people are carrying the data. Second, we can ask, what is the data? Financial figures, notes, dates, websites, rules, phone numbers, email addresses, transactions. Defining and understanding what the data is critical to digital transformation. But now we come to my favorite part, the collaboration piece. We can begin here by asking who manages the data. Is data updated by customers, vendors, customer service reps, accounting? Are there automatic uploads and downloads from and to other data sources? Who's responsible for that? Once we have an understanding of who is managing the data, then we can ask who uses the data. As a side note, everyone is not a complete answer. Developers and businesses are often surprised about how data is used and interpreted by users. I worked with a client once who discovered early in the project that the invoice due dates were being interpreted by different departments very differently. Customer service reps were adding 5 days to the due date when communicating with customers, while collections was adding 2 days to the due date to begin calls and emails. Finance was calculating late fees by adding 10 days to the due date, while the CEO's office was calculating on the actual date. They were spending more than 40 hours a month in a reconciliation process to balance late fees because each were being tracked in different notes fields in the system. It was a mess, and it was critical information to gather up front as we were designing the new system. And this leads us to a critical step called audience analysis. A focused effort on audience analysis will reveal all of the departments and people to engage through the digital transformation process. It's important to note that successful digital transformation requires a change management plan, and a change management plan will fail without engagement with those who will be involved in the project and those impacted by the project. The business organizational chart will help identify groups and departments. From there, you can identify roles, from there, people. We will be talking more about the players in the process in the next session, but it's important to identify the leaders, the managers, and the individual contributors. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll look at the different perspective these 3 roles bring to a project. In this process, it is important to identify the decision makers, very important when it comes to addressing business rules and processes. Also, identifying the subject matter experts. They know the details. Also, identifying your champions and sponsors. They are key to successful change. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm breaking the development team into 2 groups, designers, and developers. And depending on the size of the development team, this could be one person or several people. But it is important to understand that there are at least 2 points of focus. One that is related to the user interface and one that is related to core functionality. Yes, these two things are tightly integrated, so please know that it is not my intention to separate them. But it is important to recognize designers and developers do interpret the project in different ways. Now that we have looked at what is required and done some investigation into who is involved, let's explore the perceptions of the players, because varying perceptions are the leading cause of lost in translation. In this video, we've discussed digital transformation at a high level and talked some about what is required. In the next video, we will talk about the players in the digital transformation process. Please join me. In this video, we will explore the perceptions of the players and how this plays a role in translating the process of digital transformation. George Bernard Shaw said, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." I have certainly experienced this. I've worked on projects with documented requirements and delivered to those requirements, only to discover deep into the process that what I understood and what the client meant were two different things. But for weeks we thought we were in sync. It can be frustrating. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to group the business into 3 groups: leadership, management, and individual contributors. And for development, we are to talk about designers and developers. We will be talking about these groups very generally. There are always exceptions. These groups overlap and flip-flop, and I fully acknowledge and understand that. But since we're all operating from our homes these days, generalizing will help us through this virtual conversation. So if you find yourself saying, "Well, that is not how management is at my place," please know that I know that too. So here is how we will define these broad roles for this conversation. Leadership. Think executive leadership. The folks who approve the budget, the project champions are most often found here. Management. Mid-level leaders, these folks oversee functional areas of the business. The project sponsors are most often found here. Individual contributors, these are frontline staff. Your subject matter experts are most often found here. Designers, responsible for the user interface, colors, layout, navigation, workflow, etc. And developers, responsible for the data structure and the coding. Again, please recognize that we will be speaking of these players generally. There are always variances in any business and development team. But for now, let's look at the perspectives of each of these players from these definitions. You've heard the phrase, "they can't see the forest for the trees." Well, I've also found that there are folks who can't see the trees for the forest, and this has to do with individuals' perspectives. Generally speaking, leadership is often focused on the forest. Think of these folks as the executives. Leaders have to look at the big picture, often considering the entire organization when making decisions and observations about the business. They see the forest. Management is often somewhere in the middle. They may be looking at a bigger picture, but is often in the context of a department or functional area. Management sees a section of the forest and some of the trees. Individual contributors are deep in the forest. They generally have a focused function. Individual contributors see the trees. Designers are focused on the overall UI. They're thinking about standards, layout design, navigation, color, placement, etc. And designers are generally looking for the forest. Developers are generally the engineers and data structure folks. They are looking for the requirements so they can build what will work for running the business. Developers are looking for the trees. A good developer is looking for all the trees. When we think about what could get lost in translation, and we consider that each of the players is approaching a project with different perspectives, it is easy to see how miscommunications can happen. And since this process is complicated, Let's add one more layer of complication. Not only do all of these players perceive the project differently, they also perceive time differently. If we think about each player's focus in terms of time, we can generalize that leaders are often thinking about the organization's past, present, and future, which means they may bring up issues from the past that have already been resolved, but because they had a significant impact on the business, it still weighs heavily on their thinking. Additionally, a leader is thinking of the future. A leader's input into a project could be in consideration of what is to come, and they're looking at flexibility and adaptability. Management is generally focused on the present with consideration to the recent past and looking forward in terms of the next business cycle or two, while individual contributors are often focused on the present, what needs to be done right now. Designers are often focused on the future. They look at the feel of the application, the usability, how will this work going forward. Developers are often focused on the functionality, the data structure, and the code to get it working now. Again, I want to emphasize that I am speaking of the players very generally. If a person is playing multiple roles, they simply have an expanded perspective. In order to translate information conveyed during digital transformation, we can make the following generalizations. Business leadership is often a primary source for the project scope, timeline, budget, dashboards. They need the big picture. They need information related to the forest. Management generally is the primary source for business process flow, reporting requirements, and business rules. Because they see the forest and the trees, they are generally the best source for these activities. Individual contributors are generally the primary source for business process details, work instructions, job aids. Individual contributors know the details because they are generally more engaged directly with the current tools than others. Designers are generally the primary source for the UI, layouts or screens, and navigation. And developers are generally focused on the functional requirements, data structure, and are a great source for testing. Each player has a different perspective on the business and the digital transformation process, and this can often lead to translation issues. Priorities, risks, issues, timeline can all be mistranslated. Each of these and many other components of the project are all defined and perceived based on the focus of the player in terms of context and time. So how do we correctly translate the digital transformation process? In the next video, we will discuss the process of creating understanding, which is critical to correct translation. In this video, we've discussed the players and their perceptions. In the next video, we will talk about making sense and creating understanding, key to avoiding getting lost in translation. I spent a few years working for a large international technology company. My role at this time was as a change management consultant. We were implementing a single financial management tool that was to replace over 500 different legacy systems used around the world in the various facilities. It was a huge undertaking. I had brought subject matter experts and key team members from all over the world for some training and education on the new system. One night, a large group of us went to dinner together. I enjoyed these events. Having so many people speaking different languages and representing different cultures was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As we were reviewing the menu at the restaurant, the person sitting directly across from me inquired about an item on the menu that they were confused about. It was about spaghetti and meat sauce. They wanted some clarification on what meat sauce was. Before I could respond, the person to my left said, "Meat sauce? That's hamburger." When I saw the look on his face, I started to laugh. Then I explained that the meat sauce in question was ground beef in tomato sauce. We both laughed. He actually thought he was going to get a plate of pasta with a hamburger sitting on top, complete with cheese, mustard, lettuce, and tomato, and then drenched in sauce. As we were laughing, the person to my left said, "That is not what I said. I explained it was hamburger." I explained that hamburger is what Americans commonly call ground beef, and that the terminology had been interpreted as a hamburger. Then we all laughed. While this is not related to the translation of digital transformation, this story illustrates how easily, and perhaps innocently, we can contribute to translation issues. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the theory that an individual's thoughts and actions are determined by the language or languages that individuals speak. In other words, our vocabulary shapes our perception, which in turn shapes our behavior. Let me give you an example. What do you see on this slide? A mask. Until recently, this image would have not really registered as anything too significant to most people. But the current pandemic has changed that. So let me attempt to illustrate the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis using this image and word. Mask. I'm fairly certain that this image caused a specific reaction for most people. Some people made a face or gesture indicating safety and good health. Some people made a face or a gesture indicating anxiety or stress. Some people made a face or a gesture indicating a dismissive attitude. These facial expressions and gestures are behaviors. Just before the behavior happened, we each perceived the word mask, and our brains did a quick loop through our most recent experiences with masks, which prompted a behavior. It's a mask. M-A-S-K. Simple word, really. But our perceptions of what the mask stands for are created from the language we have all used and experienced around masks over the last few months. Mask means something different to people these days. So if you casually drop this word in a conversation, you may get quite a surprise in the behavior it elicits from others. Not every word creates division, but most words can certainly create confusion. Let's look at some examples for developers and businesses. Let's start with the terms often used by businesses. One of the terms I experience most often is everybody or everything. What data do we need to display on this screen? Everything. Who uses this tool? Everyone. I fully recognize where this comes from, but in 30 years of developing and implementing technology, I have never encountered a screen where every data component in the database is truly required. And users tend to find a small set of screens or fields they use over and over. Users will find a way. It might not be the right way, but they will forge a path, even creating their own spreadsheets and notes outside of the tool. So everyone and everything is worthy of exploring. It is also important to consider that systems built for people are very expensive and large amounts of customization is required. Systems built for processes require user standardization and training, but don't require processes to be adapted and customized in multiple ways for user preferences. Developers can build for people, but it is going to increase costs for the business. Other words open for interpretation are fast. Fast to a business leader is different than fast for an individual contributor. Inexpensive. Inexpensive is definitely interpreted differently for leaders, managers, and individual contributors. There are many more, so consider your own experience. What terminology has created speed bumps in your transformations? Development also has some language that can be easily mistranslated. One of these I've experienced is layout. I find that most businesses interpret that as screen. Another term that can be confusing is module. What is that? And just like the business, fast and inexpensive are open for interpretation by the development team. So you may be thinking, Will, how are we supposed to know what we are saying? Well, I'm glad you asked. The key is communication. The only way to create understanding is communication. Take a look at these items. Each of these can help in correctly translating. Let me highlight a few. Listening with empathy is critical. It is about focusing on what the other person is expressing verbally and non-verbally. How did they experience the business process? How do they feel about it? How can you do this? Plan. Review your notes and presentations and look for terms that may need definition or clarification. Check your perceptions. When you encounter different terms and concepts, stop and verify that your perception is the same or aligned. Be ready to translate. For example, try explaining relational databases and not use any tech-like language. Imagine that you can't use terms like parent, child, serial numbers, IDs, etc. I once, out of desperation and frustration, explained a relational database using Tinker Toys. And it worked! There was also an occasion where I used the making of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to explain how to write ISO 9000 compliant work instructions. Sometimes you have to be creative. More often than not, we just have to explain and align perceptions. We can also create a common language that can be used in the project. Another way to do this is to ask others about their understanding. Use paraphrasing, communicate back to the speaker what you thought you heard, and include the verbal and nonverbal content. For example, so it is critical that data is entered quickly and easily. It must be current or it creates conflict between departments. Did I get that right? You can also reframe, put the situation in various contexts, or ask about how a process would work during a different season or phase of the business cycle. Create and deliver meeting summaries to the team. Co-create documents for use by both the developers and the business, and obtain agreement and approvals before moving forward. One of the most important skills is asking good questions. And not surprisingly, asking good questions begins by listening with empathy. You can also think of this as listening for what is not being said. Good questions are open-ended, they're contextual, they're timely, they're probing. Good questions demonstrate that we're engaged, that we are understanding, or at the very least, striving to understand. Good communication during digital transformation should also produce artifacts, documents, or evidence of communication and understanding. These are just some of the artifacts or products that can be created to check that the team is communicating effectively and that we're all speaking the same language. As a test, good communication artifacts should be shared. Everyone should have access to that artifact, to that product throughout the project. They should be reviewed regularly and updated as necessary. The artifact should be reviewed and approved formally. And living artifacts like project plans, scope documents, and business process flows should include a change log so everyone can see the evolution. Knowing that language is symbolic gives us the opportunity to identify potential errors in translation. Good communication allows us to manage these translation errors when they occur, and communication artifacts keep the team aligned. In the next video, we're going to explore a unique approach to translation: storytelling. I hope you'll join me. In this video, we discussed how to make sense and create understanding. In the next video, we're going to talk about a unique approach to gathering information and putting our knowledge of the players and our communication skills to work. Storytelling is a powerful tool. Storytelling is used to tell our history, to entertain, to engage, to teach, to lead. Storytelling in the digital transformation context can build rapport, sustain relationships, reveal goals, and uncover issues, all the while building a new story. Under more normal circumstances, we would have all been together for the Claris Engage 2020 conference. For myself, I have found that the stories shared while sitting at lunch or at the bar are some of the best experiences of the conference. Hearing other developers and businesses tell about what is going on in their world is not only a great bonding experience, but it never fails to yield wonderful nuggets of learning and wisdom. The same can happen in the context of digital transformation. How does storytelling work in this context? Because storytelling is interactive, it provides a space for recognizing and creating shared experiences. Does anyone else have this experience? Each year at the conference, do you share the same story with the same people and everyone still enjoys it? That is a shared experience. Storytelling also creates avenues for understanding. When people are telling stories, they physically engage. We gesture, smile, point, move. Our volume changes to reflect things that are important. Stories also have a beginning, middle, and end. So even in the midst of a project that is being tackled in phases, we are still getting perspectives on the entire project. Storytelling also engages listeners in a way that can serve as a great springboard for new ideas and approaches. I can't tell you the number of times I've shared a story about another project, and the team grabs some piece of the story as a good idea. It also opens a dialogue about scenarios that may not have been considered yet. And stories become a great home for lessons learned. Collaborative relationships are a key to digital transformation success. We learn about each other through storytelling. We disclose thoughts and opinions that create connections. Truth be told, we're more honest and more forthcoming when we have a connection with another person. Storytelling does this. When I'm sitting with a user, I know that if I tell a story about my own experience, the door begins to open and communication flows more freely. It is awkward to have someone show up at your place of work and start asking questions about how you do your job. I try to start these encounters as a designer by introducing myself and telling a story about my work as a designer. It can break the ice and demonstrate that I'm not an auditor. I'm not here to evaluate them, but to learn about their processes. Encouraging someone to not only walk you through a transaction, but to talk about their own successes and challenges with the system also opens the door to gaining greater insight into what is needed, wanted, and useful. Insights into the attitudes, beliefs, and values of the team give a critical perspective that would otherwise be missed. And attitudes, beliefs, and values are important to successful change management. Storytelling is a great tool for identifying these. So, if you are the storyteller, think about these things. What goes well? What doesn't? What's frustrating? What's fun? What's challenging? Good stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They take us on a journey. Stories have the ability to communicate the facts, the feelings, the total experience. Stories can be entertaining, informative, persuasive, and in reality, they can be all of the above. Think about the stories you would tell about your organization and your experience. Take some notes. Practice telling the story. Have it ready when it's time to talk about the project. And don't forget to show as a part of tell. Show how you interact with a system or articulate how you would like to interact with the system. Show applications and tools you enjoy using as examples of where you want to go. Give examples of why you like them or how they've helped. Give a tour of your office or facility and talk about what people do and where they do it. This kind of experience helps everyone to get a visual of the process and the business. And don't forget to wear your mask. Oops, did I drop an emotionally charged term? Sorry. If you're listening to a story, stay active and empathic. Listen for jargon or potential translation issues. Work to focus on the other person and be careful of bringing your own attitudes and beliefs and values into your translation of their story. And don't forget to participate. Don't interrupt, but do ask questions and engage with the storyteller. And don't forget to observe what is happening non-verbally. We often skip articulating the little steps because we do them so often they are just automatic. If you're in the role of listener, make sure observer is a part of your behavior. You can see frustration. You can see ease. This provides invaluable feedback to creating and implementing apps that are embraced. Before we leave this video, I want you to think about your biggest success story. Think about how you could use that story to kick off a meeting with a new project team. What would you want to highlight? What would you want your audience to take away? If you're speaking with someone who's struggling to understand, what story could you tell about a time you were struggling? If you're speaking with someone who does not want to change, what story could you tell about your most challenging change experience? If you're speaking with someone who wants change fast, What story could you tell about good planning that led to great results, or a quick implementation that ended up having to be revisited over and over again to get it right? If you're talking to a new development team, what story could you tell that articulates your business's vision and mission? Storytelling creates the big picture and is a great place to start in establishing the relationships and rapport that drive us through digital transformation successfully. In this video, we discuss storytelling and how it can be used to explore not only the big picture, but the details necessary to understand and build for requirements. In the next video, we'll review documentation and tools to sustain the digital transformation process and keep on top of translation. In this video, I want to discuss some of the tools and documents that are extremely useful during the digital transformation process. Many of you already have these in place, which is great. And for you all, this is just a review or refresher. For those who are new to this or who may be struggling with translation issues over the digital transformation process, I hope you discover some documents and/or tools you find useful. In terms of materials and documentation, here are some good ones. Side note, this is not an exhaustive list, so my fellow project managers can take a deep breath and relax. Our goal here is reflection and planning, and there are an infinite number of resources that can be found online, and hopefully this discussion prompts some further research. I want to highlight a few that I have found particularly helpful for the translation topic we've been discussing in these videos. Meeting notes. Having a repository of meeting notes that everyone can access has proven to be a valuable asset. At Informing Designs, we think of these as diaries of a project. If more than one of us attends a meeting, one of us acts as the scribe. The scribe captures the notes and will read some notes back to clarify and get alignment. Having a designated scribe is a great tool that allows the person leading the discussion to focus on communication, knowing that the information is being captured. It's tough to do both at the same time. Business requirements. These can begin in the form of process flows or maps, and then as we get deeper into the process, they become detailed requirements. These include inputs, outputs, responsibilities, etc. They're a fantastic way to ensure alignment and keep focus. Risks and issues. Rather than solving every item at the moment they are discovered, that can make a project go on forever. Having a log of risks and issues allows us to track them, put them in the project plan to be addressed, and relating them to the appropriate business processes. I often have a section in notes that I call the parking lot. It's a place to park the ideas, risks, issues, etc. so they don't get lost. And yes, another disclaimer, sometimes a risk or issue has to be addressed immediately or very quickly, but often they need to be identified, further defined, and then addressed as appropriate. Mock-ups. As a designer, I love mock-ups. Sometimes I do these using various tools, and sometimes I draw them on my iPad, even paper on occasion. I would also add that it can be very helpful for the business and the development team to work together on them. I was involved in a very contentious screen design meeting a few years ago. I finally just went to the copier, got some paper, and handed out sheets to everyone in the meeting, and then asked them to draw the screen they wanted. Everyone started to grasp the challenge, and eventually concessions were made all around the table, and we got a screen that worked. Change logs. Not only are these significant for the project as a whole, but I recommend adding a section for change logs in specific documents. For example, business requirements will change. It's helpful to have a log of when the change was made, what it was before and after. It really comes in handy when several weeks in we can't remember why we wanted to do it that way. As I mentioned earlier, you can literally find project materials and document lists and samples with a little online research. If the project has a designated project manager, they will likely take the lead here. If you don't have a designated project manager, I would suggest you take a little time to look into these. I'm certain you'll find them valuable. I mentioned in the Creating Understanding video that project artifacts should be shared, they should be regularly reviewed, they should be formally approved, and they should have a change log. Not every document produced needs these, but the items listed on the left here are good candidates for that process. What about tools? Most of us have our favorite tools, so the list on the right are some favorites that I hear people talk about regularly. At Informing Designs, we use Slack, and it's a great communication tool. Whimsical is a great tool for process diagrams, even mock-ups, and the files are easily shared with team members. Notion is our note-taking tool of choice at the moment, and I use Sketch for graphics and mock-ups. Just some of my favorites. Again, hit the web and find the tool that works for your team. And keep in mind that the best tools allow for collaboration and visibility by the entire team. As I mentioned at the top of this video, my intent here was to prompt reflection or curiosity in what kind of documents and tools exist. When we keep in mind that team members are operating from different perspectives and that there will be translation issues along the way, having a common set of materials for reference and review helps to keep us in sync. It creates a common language and creates a common experience. In this video, we've looked at some documentation and tools that aid the translation process during digital transformation. In the next video, I will share some lessons learned over my 30-year career. Join for some storytelling that takes everything we've discussed and puts it in some real-world scenarios. In this video, I'm going to be sharing some lessons I've learned over the years, and I wanted to make this video about taking my own medicine, so story time! Hopefully you recall our conversation about the players in the digital transformation process, and I hope that you recognize that each player operates from a different perspective, from both a context and timeline perspective. In the ideal world, what does that mean? I've been in quarantine for so long, I'm not sure what anything means anymore, so let me change that. Our goal is to engage with all of these players in the digital transformation process. So you will see in this diagram that everyone is connected. But what if the development team is only talking to leadership? Remember that leadership often sees the forest and has the past, present, and future in mind. I was part of a project several years ago that began with a deep dive with some members of the leadership team. The CFO was very concerned about accounts payable. Every agenda topic took a turn towards issues with accounts payable. I left that meeting absolutely focused on accounts payable. The entire development team left with the impression this was the biggest trouble spot and the highest priority. 3 weeks later, I met with the AP folks. We mapped their current process, scrutinized the current system, talked about expectations, and it was my takeaway that they had this together. So I started asking questions based on the concerns of the CFO. The team started to giggle. I asked what was going on, and they explained that 15 years ago, the CFO spent a lot of money on an accounting system and the AP side was a mess. After 3 months, they abandoned the tool and went back to the original, and they had not experienced any issues or problems since that time. I met up with the CFO after the meeting with the AP team to talk about the results of the meeting. I went through the documents and plans, and he was pleased. So I said to him, in the deep dive, you expressed how important it was to you that the AP process be addressed. It appears to me that it is, but what am I missing? His reply, you're not missing anything. I just want to make sure. We had a disaster a few years ago. Imagine if we had not engaged any further down the chain than leadership. We may have spent time and resources to address issues that were no longer issues. His perspective was from the past, and while completely valid and important, there was little rework or redesign that needed to happen. Instead, we took his concerns and turned them into test scenarios that we used in user acceptance testing. We validated functionality and eased his concerns. One more thing to note here. If the only folks involved in the project are leaders, the development team has to trust that communication is happening to management and individual contributors. There also has to be a great deal of faith that any communication taking place is an accurate translation by leadership to management and individual contributors. I worked on a small project where the only access we had was leadership. Rollout was scheduled and I was asked to come on site for the first week to support go live. I found out that first day on site that management and staff had no clue they were getting a new system that day. My short story on this project is that the hotel bartender and I were on a first-name basis by Tuesday. So what can happen if the development team is only talking to management? Short story here. I worked on a project for a travel company. We met the owners and they turned us over to the management team saying they know it all, so do whatever they say. We went along for a few months and then got the phone call from one of the owners. They weren't happy. Why is this costing so much? Why isn't this done already? It was then that we discovered they had no intention of replacing their current system. They just wanted a side tool for tracking reservations. But management didn't know that, and neither did the development team. Now, I had shared meeting notes, sent scope documents, sent mock-ups, but the owners were clear that the management team was the go-to and there was no need for them to be involved. That project was never implemented, and the rest of that story is one for a cocktail in San Diego next year. If the only engagement is with management team members, then it is likely there is a long change curve, a steep learning curve, and unhappy individual contributors. And it is more than a little important that leadership know what is happening. They pay the bills and make the big decisions. So what if the development team is only talking to individual contributors? I can tell you this, we will know a lot about what happens on the front lines, but we are also only seeing the front line in its current state. We're just seeing the trees, and we need to be able to look forward into the future. The story that comes to mind here is an implementation I worked on during a few years in the healthcare industry. A new technology was rolled out to call centers. It was an amazing tool that analyzed voices on phone calls to detect stress. A prompt was sent to call center supervisors so that they could listen in or step in to help with a conflict. It was a really cool tool. My team and I spent 14 weeks doing training all over the country. We trained reps and supervisors. We did town hall sessions where the managers and VPs spoke about the importance of the tool and its use. They were great champions and great sponsors. My team offered to train the call center managers and VPs on the admin side of the tool, but they declined. A month later, things got crazy. During a J.D. Powers review, 2 senior VPs were unable to answer questions about the tool, so they called in a manager who happened to be at corporate that day, and the manager was unable to log in to demo the tool. The manager left and retrieved some handouts on the tool, which is a big no-no in an audit to go to paper, especially when you consider they were trying to show how automation had made everything streamlined and improved quality. In this particular case, my team had not designed the tool, but our only engagement in the implementation of the tool had been with the individual contributors and supervisors. And while we attempted to engage management and leadership, they had declined. And clearly the internal communications of the division had failed to provide the information needed. In my personal experience, communication initiated by individual contributors rarely gets to leadership without going through several filters, which can, not always, but can be dramatically different in terms of its intent and its content. Similarly, engaging with just designers or just developers can present some challenges. If the business team is only talking to designers, then the developers may be getting secondhand information about functionality. And if the business is only talking to developers, the application may work great, but the business may struggle with how to use it, how to interact with it. As I've done throughout these videos, I want to pause and recognize that the players are not always so clearly defined in separate roles. We all wear many hats. My title is Senior Designer, but I'm also a developer. I have several projects where I'm the designer and the developer, so that should make it easier on the business, right? Only one person to engage with. Well, I could make an argument for that, but the truth is I have to stay aware of the perceptions I'm bringing to the projects at all times. It's very easy for me to drift to designer mode and only view the project from that perspective. To help me broaden my approach, I set up meeting notes with questions and topics that require me to shift my perspective between design and development to ensure that I'm covering all the bases. A final lesson learned that I want to share has to do with individual contributors. The most successful projects I have ever worked on looked like the diagram you see here. Engagement between all the players. The least successful projects I've ever worked on were projects where the team was missing substantive engagement with individual contributors. Designers and developers who spend time with individual contributors get the information they need to build for what is actually happening at the point of the work. And you can't see me at the moment, but I just put air quotes around the word work. Leaders work and management works. I am not questioning that. But the folks who interact most directly with data are the individual contributors. What they do has an immediate impact on the flow of information through the application. Applications built with meaningful engagement with individual contributors improve quality, efficiency, and decrease the amount of time for new hires to get to proficiency. In this video, I've shared some lessons learned from my career. My goal was to apply the topics from the series and give some perspective. Meaningful engagement across all the players is critical to successful projects. In the final video, we're going to take a trip through the series, hit some high points, and wrap up. Please join me for the conclusion of digital transformation lost in translation. In this video, I want to take a moment and revisit the topics of this presentation. First, identifying the players is critical. Who all plays in space, and what are their needs? Always keeping in mind that the team members are operating from different perspectives that inform priorities, scope, risks, issues, and timeline. These perspectives create many opportunities to get lost in translation. How do we address lost in translation? Communication. Translate and check your understanding. Listen with empathy, and recognize the different player perspectives. Use storytelling to build and sustain relationships necessary to navigate digital transformation. Storytelling reveals important history, conveys attitudes, beliefs, and values, and begins writing the story that will be eventually told about the project. Use tools that are centered on collaboration. Going to the source document is the baseline. It provides a validation of perceptions and fosters accurate translation. A mentor of mine once shared this with me, and it sets my mindset when approaching projects. Expect the best, prepare for the worst, and intentionally manage everything in between. And I'd like to conclude with this. Tell your story. Why? There are always lessons to be learned about our own experiences by reflecting on those experiences, and your story can serve as a springboard for new ideas and approaches on new projects. Telling your stories to different audiences can reveal amazing translations all parties can find helpful. It's square and it's made of glass. I will never forget that story. I think I've told it hundreds of times over the last 25 years, and every time I tell it, people will stop to tell me their own version of it. And those stories led to conversations about shared experiences and lessons learned. And some of those people have become clients, teammates, and friends. The last time I was in Thailand, I was eating at a restaurant and was having trouble ordering. The staff was struggling to understand me, and I was struggling to understand them. I have a small Thai vocabulary and can generally navigate around an order, but I was struggling. When my food was brought to the table, I began to eat. I noticed a gentleman sitting nearby watching me intently. Just at the point where I was becoming uncomfortable with his staring, he leaned toward me and said, "How do you know how to eat noodles?" His accent was very heavy, but it was excellent English. I explained that my father had fallen in love with the Thai culture when he was stationed there with the Air Force. My dad taught me a lot of Thai vocabulary as a child, and he often cooked Thai food. He had learned from a local woman who cleaned the barracks. As I was telling this story, the gentleman moved to my table. He was smiling and laughing. He announced to the entire restaurant that the American knows how to eat noodles. He began ordering food and drinks. The owner came out and sat with us. We drank, we laughed, and we ate ourselves silly. The conversation was frequently interrupted as we tried to find the right words to express ourselves in both languages, but in the end, a good time was had by all. Yes, I know that story isn't about digital transformation, but it speaks to the intent of this presentation. When you find yourself lost in translation, it is a worthy exercise to find the issue and address it. Open communication and awareness can really open up opportunities for success. Lost in translation? Yes, I started there at the beginning of that meal. You know, when I think about it, that story is related to digital transformation. Every project starts with the players looking at the same menu, but struggling to articulate the items in a way that everyone understands. Then something happens. It may be a mock-up review or a process mapping exercise, but something happens that creates a light bulb moment, and bam! That shared experience starts to create shared translation, and now the team is on its way. So there you go. A gross oversimplification of how to manage digital transformation. But I do hope that you were able to find a nugget or two that you can use to avoid getting lost in translation. Thank you for joining me, and please reach out if you have questions or comments. Thank you again. I hope to see all of you at Claris Engage 2021.